Welcome back to the World Order After COVID-19 Forum. I'm Frank Gavin, the director of the Kissinger Center. And one of the things that I think has become quite clear about this crisis is that it's not just a medical crisis, it's not just an economic crisis, but it's also a political crisis. And this third panel, which has an excellent roundup of scholars and experts, will be looking at global politics and governance after COVID-19. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Alina Polyakova as the chair. Alina is a sociologist, an expert on a variety of very important topics relating to this, including Russian foreign policy and the effect of digital technologies, widely published in a number of prestigious publications, ranging from the New York Times to Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic. And she's also just recently, is it okay to say recently? I guess you've been there for a while, become the president and CEO for the Center for European Policy and Analysis. And we're thrilled that she could join us. So thank you, Alina, for chairing this, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Frank and Hal and everyone who put this incredible conference together for having me. I've been watching throughout the day, following the conversations, which have been fantastic. And it's just an honor to be able to chair and moderate this very distinguished panel on the global politics and governance after COVID-19. So we'll have 45 minutes for discussion. So after I introduce all of my colleagues here, I would just ask everyone to stick to about 7 minutes in your comments so we can have time to have a conversation. I'm sure there will be lots of questions coming in from the audience. I will probably have a couple myself after I hear what all of you have to say, but just to echo what Frank said at the onset, I think certainly none of us expected back, let's say in February, certainly not those of us in the United States, that we would, for example, still be staying at home and doing virtual convenings of this kind come summer 2020. And I think what's become very clear, of course, is that there's a very long tail of COVID-19 that is increasingly taking us into questions around security, questions around the future of democracy and the future of politics. And I think we're going to see the fallout of what was initially a public health crisis in a variety of ways that will reshape the geopolitical order. And I think that for that reason, this panel and this conference in general is very, very timely and an urgent conversation for us to have together. So without further ado, let me just quickly introduce all of our panelists. And I could spend the entire hour just with introductions. Everyone has such a distinguished career, but so I'll do a quick version of that. Anne Applebaum, who's joining us from Poland, is staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. She is the Johns Hopkins SAIS and SNF Agora Institute professor, where she also co-directs ARENA, a research project that investigates disinformation and the 21st century propaganda, and has a new book coming out, which is incredible because I feel like and always has a fantastic new book coming out. This one will be out just next month in July. It's called The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, just in a couple of weeks. And she, of course, is the recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for her 2004 nonfiction book, The Gulag. I also have with me Henry Farrell, who's professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, and the 2019 winner of the Friedrich Schiedel Prize for Politics and Technology. And I know him best because he's editor and in chief of the Monkey Cage blog on the Washington Post. So thank you so much for joining us, Henry, who will be delivering his comments together with Hari Hahn, who's the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute and professor of political science, faculty director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins, and also has a new book out, co-authored with a few colleagues from the University of Chicago, entitled Prisms of the People, Power, and Organizing in 21st Century America, which sounds really interesting, exciting to me. And certainly last, but very much not least, Janice Gross-Stein is the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science. And she was also the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, one of the top public policy schools in the world, the University of Toronto. Her most recent publication with a colleague, it focuses on testing the deterrence by denial and experimental results from criminology in the Journal of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism will be out next year. So without further ado, Anne, let me just start with you and for your 7 minutes of remarks on the paper and the work you did as part of this project. And you might be on mute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Alina. Thank you, Frank. Thank you to the Kissinger Center for organizing this. My paper and my, the main puzzle of the moment, my paper begins with let's be honest, the collapse of international institutions at the very beginning of this pandemic. The failure to coordinate the closure of borders, the sudden panics over and the competition over masks and gowns and PPE, the disappearance of all kinds of clubs. The EU suddenly seemed to be nowhere. The foreign ministers of the G7 had one meeting to write some kind of statement, and even that project ended in rancor when the American Secretary of State insisted on using the expression Wuhan virus and the others wouldn't sign the declaration. And the most spectacular failure was that of the World Health Organization. Despite the, it's now become politicized, this story, and people are, there's some difficulty talking about it, but we can't really deny the fact that the WHO adhered a little bit too closely to the narrative of the Chinese government at the beginning of the crisis. It didn't listen to warnings from Taiwan, which is not a member of the WHO, thanks to Chinese pressure, even though Taiwan is a credible voice. Ignored also warnings from Hong Kong and others, and was therefore late in making a number of declarations about what had happened. The question is, why did this happen? Why was there this sudden reimposition of borders, this sense of international collapse? And, while some, you can blame some of this on coincidence, particularly European governments not being oriented, not being used to this kind of crisis and so on, there were, I think, 4 reasons that were really quite, that underlay this. One of them is the decision by the US administration to be absent. And in fact, it's a decision that was taken 3 years ago to change America's relationship to international organizations, not to be a leader either of the democracies or of the international community as a whole, and instead to begin to use the word sovereignty when talking about international politics. And sovereignty in the international system means something very specific. It's the word that nations use when they want to deny international institutions legitimacy of any kind. UN agencies, independent human rights monitors, anyone who criticizes state policy, when anyone protests the Iranian regime's extrajudicial murders or the Chinese government's repression in Hong Kong, those governments respond with the word sovereignty. The Trump administration took up this word as its motto as well. This happened at the same time as the Chinese government has been putting pressure on the international system for, really a decade now, seeking to instill its values inside the UN system. So just as the US withdraws, the Chinese are pushing for more influence. They've expanded, I can, list all the organizations they now control. China's expanded the country's presence in UN peacekeeping operations, uses financial tools to persuade other countries to vote its way in the UN and elsewhere. It's also used financial tools it's also attempted to coordinate its Belt and Road investment policy with the UN to make them seem like they're interlocking and the same. And one of the side effects of this, there's no direct link, but one of the side effects is that international institutions are increasingly reluctant to challenge China. And that was that we could see that in the WHO reaction. At the same time, we see the failure of the Europeans to form a common front, even with one another, but also with other democracies, failure to create links across the world. Europe still acts like a regional bloc. It's not really part of this conflict of ideas, this set of arguments over what should international institutions be, and at least not as loudly as it ought to be. And then finally, there's a kind of fourth and final source of weakness that applies to all the institutions under discussion, and indeed many national democracies, which is that these are institutions conceived and built in the 20th century based on models created in the 19th century. And many of them simply can't do their jobs with the speed and efficiency that modern citizens now demand. And that's one of the reasons why people have so little faith in them. You can buy a pair of shoes by clicking a computer mouse, and it can take months and months for any decision to be taken in Geneva or New York. In my paper, and maybe we can talk about this later, I suggest a few ways of thinking about change and how to think about the system differently. And actually, one of the suggestions I had is that we might look at how did scientists respond to this crisis? And the answer is that they responded in a very different and more efficient way. Scientists were able to cooperate very quickly. They immediately created networks, whether it was virologists or epidemiologists, to discuss the crisis, to exchange genetic information and other information about disease, about cures that were being tried. And they immediately focused on the necessary problems at hand. And the question is, could we begin to think about international cooperation in a similar way? So instead of creating endless institutions that are constantly outdated and therefore need to be reformed, could we begin to think a little bit differently? Could we have a floating pool of people who can manage online conferences, provide that kind of expertise, move from project to project? Could we think more ad hoc in terms of international institutions? I mean, this is not an entirely new idea. Before we had the International Criminal Court, we used to have ad hoc war crimes tribunals. And in a way, those might have been more effective. They don't create the backlash. They don't create the entrenched bureaucracy. They may simply be a different way of organizing international institutions in the future. And finally, I would say, this should be a wake-up call to the world's democracies, to think more broadly about what is going to be our strategy for the next decade. After putting counterterrorism at the center of national grand strategy, in 2018, the US formally adopted a national security strategy that was focused instead on great power competition, the dual threat from Russia and China. But although we've made investments in building up American military power, we haven't given that much thought to the battle of ideas, how to win the coming contest between democracy and dictatorship, in the UN system, out of the UN system. Europe hasn't really thought this through yet either. The Europeans, as I said, still think of themselves as a kind of regional power. They're not part of a bigger and broader conversation. Lip service is paid to the need to promote human rights or tolerance, but not that much time is spent on the real world issues that could unite the international democratic camp, as well as inspire those outside it who'd like to join. There are some issues like ending kleptocracy and corruption. We could create institutions, we could create new emotions around that, and of course, climate change. Anyway, these are just a few suggestions. Until now, the authority of many international institutions has come simply from the fact that every nation of the world belongs to them. The authority of new institutions that are grounded in democratic values might have to come from something else, from the power of language, from the example of their members, from the strength of their commitment, and of course, maybe from a renewed American leadership, if we get that in the fall. A revival of our commitment to universal values is necessary, although I don't think that should be lip service. I don't think it should be rote, just saying the words because they, because that's what we're used to doing. I'd like to see the United States and the other democracies commit to a real reform of the international system. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. You certainly put a lot of ideas on the table. I was taking some of my notes, but I'll save my questions for you for a little later. Certainly your point about democracies waking up to the broader challenge beyond building institutions, beyond military power, the projection of that power across the world, but how do we actually win in the battle of ideas? I think that's an important element that I hope we can touch on in the discussion. Henry, let me take it over to you to give us a sense of the paper that you and Hari put together.
Wonderful. So what Hari and I wanted to do was to talk about the contradictions between international openness and national democracy. So this is a story that we've heard different versions of over the last number of years, but where the coronavirus is giving a very interesting and very unusual new set of pressures, which are leading perhaps in some quite unexpected ways. So very roughly, what we think is that if you think about this liberal international order, it is supposed to be all about openness internationally, open flows of trade, open flows of finance, open flows of information to some degree. And it's also supposed to be about supporting democracy at the national level. But if you look at how these work in practice, they tend not necessarily to fit together particularly well. So that if you look at the standard international institutions of the old liberal international order, by and large, these institutions have been pretty well insulated from national forms of democracy, which are perceived not unreasonably as introducing a lot of messiness, a lot of factionalism and whatever. So that in effect, the idea is that the major decisions during the golden age of globalization and of openness that we've seen up until the recent past were very often taken in these multilateral settings or by national bureaucracies who were in some way or another insulated, as for example in the United States, when we had trade negotiations, the trade negotiators effectively had fast track, which meant that it was possible for them to reach agreements with only a minimal degree of ability of the U.S. Congress to stick its oar in. So this is potentially problematic. The way in which this was justified was that people by and large thought about the interests of democratic citizens as being consumer interests primarily. They assumed, and this is a story of my home discipline of international relations, much more than Harry's home discipline, they assumed that international institutions were more or less responsive to the needs of ordinary citizens. And because of this, they assumed that these more or less insulated institutions, these insulated global arrangements could come up with democratically justifiable policy decisions. And that has become increasingly incongruous over the last number of years. And as Eric Schmidt talked about in his presentation this morning, this is linked into the questions of global inequality. We saw how it was that increasingly in many national systems, we saw higher and higher levels of inequality being produced. And so how we talk about this in the paper, we talk about how this in a certain sense has been revealed in very important ways by the coronavirus crisis. So if you look at the impact of the coronavirus crisis, it very starkly has highlighted many of the economic and political inequalities, which in effect were papered over by our standard ways of thinking about how globalization works. So if you look at the people who have borne the impact of the coronavirus in terms of infection rates, in terms of mortality, in terms of getting less attention paid to them in the stages of trying to remediate coronavirus, you see that there is a very stark impact on the working poor. You see that there's a stark impact in the United States on the African American community. You see that there is a stark impact on the Latino community, as best as we can tell from the initial statistics. And this is, in many ways, this reflects many of the ways in which the economy has been constructed. So that, for example, if you look at where many of the most problematic nodes in the networks that produce contagion have been places like meatpacking plants and slaughterhouses, in which effectively you see very, very limited protection. You see effectively people who have minimal ability to protect themselves, and you see a regulatory system which has more or less been hands off. So on a very, and this is very much connected into the global system. You see this also happening, for example, in places like Singapore, where the great difficulty that Singapore has had in getting a kind of track and trace system up and running has been that in the initial version, they paid very little attention to migrant workers who both didn't have any particular rights, they were more or less invisible, but also who tended to be to have to live together in large barrack-style dormitories dormitories, where of course they were far more vulnerable to this disease getting out, and hence were more likely to pass it on as well to other members of the population. So you can see how it is that many of the inequalities that have been produced by this global system really come to the fore and really are illustrated in a very, very stark light by the way in which coronavirus appears to have a differential impact. And of course, we're likely to see more and more happening in the relationship of inequality between countries if we begin to get into a world in which, for example, we see a contention between different countries over who gets access to a vaccine first. There already is a lot of jostling happening over patent rights, over patent pooling, and so on. And we can very plausibly see how we would end up in a world in which it is a fight between the rich countries who are likely to get to the top of the queue, and poorer countries are less likely to do that. So this is a very pessimistic story in a sense, but there's also something more optimistic which has been happening, or at least potentially optimistic, which again is which has been accelerated greatly by the coronavirus pandemic. So when we think about globalization, when we think about these inequalities, when we think about the ways in which global institutions tend to reflect the interests of elites more than the interests of ordinary people, we also tend pretty straightforwardly very often to get into an argument about right-wing populism, about the sources of right-wing populism, and about the ways in which these forms of disconnection have played into the hands of people like Trump, like Orban, like many other demagogues across the world. But there also is a different mobilization story that has been happening over the last few years in the United States and to some extent elsewhere, which has been getting much less attention than the rise of right-wing populists, which is the mobilization that we have seen within the African-American community, among women in particular, white women as well as African-Americans. And we have seen an extraordinary degree of mobilization, which has really burst forth in the last few weeks in the quite literally unprecedented number and extent of protests that we've seen spreading across the United States, including in parts of the United States that are not metropolitan areas, Rust Belt cities in Pennsylvania, small towns, exurbs. All of these have this extraordinary protest movement going and up and running. And this suggests that there's perhaps a different story to be told about coronavirus as well, because it's very hard to imagine that we would have seen this kind of extraordinary diffusion of protest happening had it not been for the ways in which coronavirus made many of these inequalities more straightforward and more immediate and more obvious in their impact. And over the longer term, it's quite possible that these are going to have a longer term impact in the United States and perhaps in other countries such as France and the United Kingdom, where they have spread to some lesser degree than the right-wing populists that we have tended to pay attention to. So it could be that we're living in a world in which some of the national forms of democratic organizing, which have to some extent in the past been displaced by these international systems and have withered away to some degree, because when decisions are being taken outside of the nation state, it's very, very hard to keep democratic politics and party contention up and running in a healthy way. It may be that we're seeing a kind of an upswelling from the bottom up, which is going to have all sorts of interesting and important consequences for the international realm, because we have yet to even begin to think about how we could see, so if we see this beginning to reshape US politics in November and afterwards, we've very little way of thinking about how it is that this is going to, how we can reshape the international institutions that we have in ways that can make them more responsive and in ways that can perhaps allow them to withstand and to channel this new wave of organizing that is happening. In the paper, we talk a little bit about this towards the end. We make some suggestions based upon experiments in conventions and randomly selected citizens. But this, frankly, is a work in progress, and the standard difficulties that we're all aware of translating democratic politics into an international realm where first of all, there's a lot of contention between democracies, and secondly, there are a lot of non-democratic states. There is a lot of work to be done. So that's, in a nutshell, I think, at least some of the major arguments of our paper.
Thank you, Henry. I think one of the interesting points that you alluded to in your comments is in the broader tension between national and international dynamics and the trends you describe. What I found really fascinating about the most recent protests in the United States around Black Lives Matter is this was the first time that these, what are usually considered US problems, have had a global movement behind them as well. It really resonated across Europe in a way that they had not before. That brought to light a lot of the racial tensions in a way that I think a lot of Europeans have never thought of before, but certainly the international nature of what has traditionally been seen as part of American exceptionalism, the race problem that we've had in America since our founding, now has had this broader international component. I'm curious to hear more once we have discussion as to how you think about this moment and that sort of seeping in and overlap between national mobilization, international mobilization, and how you see that playing out at the political level going forward in a broader picture beyond the United States as well. But Hari, let me give you an opportunity to add anything you would like to add to what Henry already put out there. I think he did a really fantastic job summarizing paper, but I'm sure there's a lot more in there that we won't be able to get to. So let me give you the floor.
Sure. Let me just start by saying that it's wonderful to be here. So thank you, Alina, for organizing us. And it's great to be a part of this terrific conference. And I should also just add that it's been great fun to work with Henry on this paper because as of tomorrow, Henry will be joining us at Johns Hopkins and the SNF Agora Institute. And we couldn't be more delighted to have him on board. But Henry did a wonderful job summarizing the paper. And so I won't add very much except to just say that I think one of the things that we were thinking about in the relationship between national politics and international politics is this question of accountability. And that one of the, if we think about the sort of challenges of governance that emerged with respect to coronavirus and some of the failures of the international institutions that Anne, for example, described in her opening remarks, that a lot of that sort of shows this kind of broken link of accountability between international regimes or international governing institutions and the public. And one of the questions that we wanted to query was what is the extent to which we can think about a sort of kind of fractal of levels of accountability that nest from the kind of protest movements, the activity that we see going on within national borders, within domestic politics, and how that layers up to national and international levels. And so some of the examples that we were drawing on in the paper were trying to explore the extent to which the practices of the ways in which people engage with each other to hold subnational and national governments accountable can give us lessons that might be applicable to international institutions. Knowing, of course, that those institutions are linked to democratic publics in very different ways. And so it raises a whole set of questions that still have to be resolved, but that to think about what the prospects for globalization and the global order moving forward, we have to better understand how we can hold some of those international regimes accountable to the public interest in these ways. So I'll pause there, but look forward to the ongoing conversation.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll pick up on some of that in the discussion. So Janice, let me hand it over to you now to lay out what you put down in your work and in your paper.
Thank you so much. And just a special thank you to Frank, to Hal, irrespective of our desperate need to talk to each other, which we all feel on its merits. This is just a wonderful initiative. So thank you to SICE as well. And of course to President Daniels, whom I understand I got this ball rolling. Just terrific, really just terrific that you did this. The big point I want to make, and it aligns with Anne, but with slightly different shading than you gave it, is that I think this is a moment of innovation for international institutions. There is, I think, an opening for fresh design thinking in the way we think about international governance. Now, why do I think that? I would just cast the argument a little differently from you. It's not either or arguments with respect to international institutions. It's not reform of international institutions. I applaud the people who have the energy and the perseverance to do that, but I'm not optimistic about the prospects, frankly. With all due respect to the great panel that came before us, and kudos to their courage. But it is about looking at hybrid models that we actually see evolving. And you talked about one of them. I'm going to come back to those, which are the way scientists work together, which I think is really interesting and is grounded, so that we can really learn something for it. So just to back up quickly, why do I think there is a moment for innovation? And almost everyone has talked about this, which is the deepening competition between the United States and China, which clearly has an impact on the way international institutions function. These institutions do not exist in some normative void. I myself, all these factors that COVID has shone a spotlight on, that Hari, you and Henry illustrated, were all there before the pandemic. So I think there's a consensus from almost everybody that this is not a game changer, but that it's a spotlight and an accelerator on changes that we were seeing before. I had done work on 5G and how that was kind of the barometer of really meaningful change between the United States and China. And Eric Schmidt made the case for me because he said, I was just delighted, and Frank is laughing because Frank and I have tossed this ball around, but Eric's comment that, of course, this competition over the shaping of the digital communications infrastructure is so critical because platform technology is so critical in shaping international orders. And I think when Eric put it this way, when we fragment the stack, we split the world. I think that's very much where we are right now, with an undetermined outcome, because policy will matter here. But what that raises for me is the big issue. Are there governance openings here for how we think about this deepening competition over digital technology? The second big one, and you started us off this way, is what we call the rebordering of the world. When you looked at the scramble for PPE, I think it's obvious to all of us that international institutions receded into the background in the crisis. And we saw very heavily driven national responses. I'm Canadian, and oh my goodness, we closed our border with the United States. That has never happened in the history of this continent. We've never done that because we live and die by our openness to the United States. So that, and it's still closed, by the way, to everything but essential travel. You stop a Canadian on the street and you tell them that, they're speechless, frankly. So that is the kind of thing that we're seeing. And we see this too, but this is older. This is pre-COVID. We've had a discussion about digital sovereignty. And I know you talked about sovereignty in a different context, but we've had a discussion about digital sovereignty. We've had a discussion about data localization, which is a pretty word for saying store our data within our national borders. This cloud discussion that we've been having, those clouds are on the ground in servers. And we want a voice and we want control. But the voice part really matters. And we want a voice about where our citizens' data is stored. And that seems to me connects directly, Harry, to the point that you were making earlier. And finally, we've seen a retreat from globalization in trade and goods, not in trade and services and not in data flows, but definitely in goods, and the reemergence of regions as hubs for trade. So what does that tell me about the order that I think all of us would agree that we are moving away from the international order that was constructed after World War II by a United States that understood that international institutions had a role to play and that the United States would benefit from those institutions. So we all know what we're moving away from. What we're moving toward is much more open for debate. But I think your first panel, Frank, that started us off this morning, laid out two big options, which is enduring rivalry that rules out collaboration, or as Graham Allison put it, a rivalry among partners, which allows for collaboration, competition. And I think the interesting point here is that the future is not determined. It will be dependent on policy choices that leaders make, and it will be dependent to some degree on the governance institutions that were able to stand up. So where do I see the opportunity for innovation? I did a quick look in the paper at the WHO and the WTO, which were in deep trouble, both of them, before Corona. I'm going to have to ask you to take me on faith here because of the time, but the paper lays that out. So where then do we look for governance innovation? And I called my paper, Take It Off Site. And I think there are three examples. Each one shows a different path to governance innovation. The first of these, and there's a wonderful, wonderful study of this by Amy Kopczynski. Henry, Henry sent me that when we were talking back and forth, but it's just outstanding. She describes the flu network. What's so interesting about the flu network? It starts off exactly as Anne talks about it. Scientists got together and they leap over boundaries and they share data in real time and they create websites where you diagnose and mount genetic patterns of virus. But over the next 5 or 6 years, they engage in an extensive negotiation with the WHO. And they set up an international collaboration among national labs that run within the framework of the WHO. They work out a funding pattern for IP. They work out rules for data sharing. And so I see this as innovative governance, which starts off-site but moves on-site, and you get this really cool hybrid model. Now, why is this of interest to us? When Corona erupted, about 85% of the labs that are doing testing are affiliated with the flu network. So you could almost talk about this as a network in waiting for the pandemic. That's, I think, an interesting story. A second example goes the other way. It moves from on-site to off-site, so the arrows point the other way, and that's the WTO story. I think we all know that President Trump weaponized the WTO by going after its judges on the appellate body, and so it's paralyzed. So what happened was a group of like-minded states simply devised a workaround. Now, that workaround incorporates WTO processes. So it's not a standalone workaround for arbitrating trade disputes. It's a hybrid model which lifts up and transports and moves over a lot of WTO processes, but simply works around what the Trump administration decides to do. And there are some 37 countries who have now signed on to this kind of method. The third one that we don't pay a lot of attention to, and I'd love to bump this over to Eric if he's still in the room, and if he's not, we'll follow up afterwards, is governance through standard setting. And that is just such an interesting story. These are private companies that set standards for interoperability of technology, which is what Eric talked about earlier this morning. That is critically important if we're going to avoid that fragmentation that he talked about. And we have such a standard setting process going on right now with respect to 5G. China takes it extraordinarily seriously and sends its best engineers to the standard setting process. The participation by US engineers, from everything we know, has been less episodic. In one of the most astonishing decisions that I can remember in my very long career in international relations. The Department of Commerce barred indirectly US engineers from participating in this standard setting process. Somebody must have told them what, as we say in Canada, an own goal that is. They just clarified that took a month, that US engineers are now able to go back. But standard setting is a third model. It's a model of governance which is private companies making rules and setting standards that have huge impact on the way what is fundamentally public platform technologies will operate, or how these platform technologies will operate in public space. If you look at those three models, I think there's an encouraging story here on international governance. And the story, I think, is that it's not either international institutions or innovation, but it's innovation around to the side and through international institutions. And I use a phrase that is coded and loaded, but we call it like-minded, who can see their way through the thicket. And that's where the policy and the strategy comes in.
Thank you, Janice. That was fascinating. I thought that since you specifically were responding to a few comments that Anne had put out, I want to give Anne the opportunity to respond to what you just said. But before I go back to Anne, I think there's a common thread that I've seen emerge from everything all of you have said. One of them being is this broader question about not what is just the future of international institutions, but what has been or has not been their role in responding, mitigating the effects of the crisis. And then how do we understand, based on that, future crises responses and where they'll be coming from, whether it be from the national level, which then takes us very much to this question of sovereignty that Anne put on the table and that you just picked up on from the digital sovereignty perspective, which is a slightly different understanding of it. But at the end of the day, I think this question of what is the role of national governments on all these sets of issues, whether that comes to innovation, whether that comes to crisis response, whether that comes to broader social and political movements, and how even those movements, as you said, Janice, that innovation is working kind of through and around international institutions. In a way, that's what we also see with some of these social movements that Henry and Hari were talking about in their comments and in their paper. So I see the tensions that you are all elaborating on really having a lot to do with the future internationalism more broadly, and just the future of the ability of those structures that we've established to still continue to be responsive, continue to be effective in mitigating future crises, while at the same time engendering innovation. So Anne, I said I would take it over to you to respond to Janice, so why don't you go ahead? Anne, you're still on mute.
Sorry. The central question about international institutions is, do we want them to be able to hold national governments to account? In other words, is there a kind of another, do we want, I don't know, the UN Human Rights Council to be able to say to China, you may not repress the Uyghurs, or please don't repress the Uyghurs? Do we want the WHO to be able to say to China, no, you need to give us more information because Taiwan has just told us something that doesn't square with what you just told us? So do we want them to have any, extra, sort of extra national power or influence? And, this is to some degree, this has always been determined by power structures. So when the United States was the most powerful country in the world, then in practice, the UN institutions or other institutions could, they could have some power if they were being backed by the United States. Now that we're not in that situation anymore, now that the US is withdrawing from the system, and by the way, some of that withdrawal did begin before this administration, this isn't totally new. And now that we have China seeking to dominate the international system from a different perspective and with a different set of goals and with a very different set of political ideas, the question, that now becomes even more dramatic. Do we want international institutions to take on an authoritarian voice and use their power that way. And it's almost an unanswerable question. I mean, it can't be resolved outside of current politics. And I mean, I think to me, as I said, the only answers have to do with either we create institutions that are based on shared values, which will include democracy or transparency or other things, and we find ways to, as Janice was talking about, the values of the internet. Do we find is there going to be a democratic internet that can challenge or offer some alternative to the Chinese-dominated internet, for example? That's one way of thinking about it. And then another way of thinking about it is that we set up institutions that are useful for particular moments or particular problems. I mean, maybe we need an international institution that just focuses on pandemics and can be activated, if need be at that time. So what I'm not disagreeing with Janice in any way. I'm just saying that we're stuck in a lot of mindsets about what these things do and how they work and what they're for, that come from another era, which isn't coming back. And so, let's focus on what the problem, what do we need these institutions to do? What is the point of them? What are the problems they have to solve? And then once we understand what that, and what are the problems that they can solve, because obviously they can't solve a lot of other problems. And once we figured out that, what's the structure that works?
Thanks, Anne. I want to go back to Henry and Hari on the similar issue, but some of our colleagues who you know very well, Anne as well, have worked on this idea of sharp power. And one of the elements of that idea is that because international institutions aren't just contained to like-minded democracies, we want to call it that, because they do include countries like China and Russia in particular. It's been this slow kind of strategic intent, certainly by China, to transform those institutions from within. And the big question that comes up is, what is the nature of those institutions now? Because they were based on an idea of inclusivity, including different points of view, but that has also given an avenue for authoritarian states to then transform those institutions to fit their models and their strategic intent, which is counter-democratic and goes against those original values of transparency and inclusion in many ways. And how do we now understand, like the WHO is, I think, the top example of that, as you and others have pointed out, how do we now understand what those institutions are supposed to be doing when they are being subverted, if you will, in the interest of non-democratic values and principles? And Henry and Hari, I want to bring you back into the conversation. But I think one of the things that is coming out from the exchange between Janice and Anne for me is also this question of how do we start to see democratic space not as a vulnerability, but as an asset. And that is very true for the digital and kind of internet space more broadly. But I think we've been on this sort of back foot of thinking about democracies as vulnerable to all of these different incursions from authoritarian states. But in fact, we're not thinking about the democratic values and principles and how democracies, yes, they're slow. Yes, they may not always fulfill the needs and desires of citizens in as efficient way as possible. But at the end of the day, it's a system that does provide for greater freedom, certainly in individual rights, than what the Chinese model would suggest. Let me take it over to you, Henry and Hari, to see if you want to come into this conversation that Anne and Janice are having as well. Henry?
Okay, well, if I can begin, first of all, it's a fascinating question that you raised just at the end. And one of the reasons that I'm really excited to be coming to SNF Agora is because this is stuff that I have been working on with Bruce Schneier. He's a cryptographer and a scholar of information. And we are really interested in figuring out a comparative understanding of the informational vulnerabilities of autocracies and democracies, figuring out how they may be vulnerable to different kinds of informational deficiencies. And one part of that is, and this gets back into, in a weird way, Eric Schmidt's discussion of machine learning this morning. My personal bet is that machine learning is going to be a disaster for autocracies in some of the ways that are described in a book which is eminently not about technology, or at least not about our version of technology, James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, which is more or less, it's a book about bureaucracy, and it's a book about how bureaucracy can shape the world and can misunderstand the world in ways which create these kind of ramifying feedback loops, which result in horrific outcomes like the ones that we are familiar with in authoritarian regimes. And I've got to wonder whether machine learning processes are going to have the same kinds of consequences. So if you have some kind of a unsupervised learning process or whatever, are you the values of the regime feed into the initial targets that are set, and then create a ramifying feedback loop in which all sorts of crazy and unpleasant things can start to happen. So a lot of people talk about this wonderful marriage between authoritarianism and machine learning. I am a bit skeptical because I can see many ways in which machine learning can reinforce many of the informational flaws that we know that autocratic systems already have. But to get back to the conversation between Janice and Anne, one of the reasons, as Harry said, we had a lot of fun writing this paper together. And one of the reasons that we were able to do this in a compatible way is because both of us are big fans of the work of John Dewey. And Dewey is a weird figure because on the one hand, his arguments about publics, they're primarily taken as being about American democracy, but it's also, there's a radical international, a rethinking of international space that is a big part of this that tends to get misunderstood and underestimated. And so when we talk about, as Alina says, these two different forms of new thing which are emerging, which both Anne and Janice talked about, which are, so you have on the one hand, you have these expert networks beginning to spring up like sort of ivy around the pillars of the existing international order and to entangle. And on the other hand, these social movements, both of these are transnational phenomena. These are not sort of above the nation state. These are weaving together politics within different national systems in unexpected ways. And this is something that we really don't understand particularly well because it falls between comparative and politics and international relations. And what I would say is that for this to be successful, the Deweyan argument at least, is that you need to have the experts as represented by the networks and the publics as represented by these mass movements. You need to have these in some kind of constructive dialogue with each other. And so I think if you want to have the more optimistic take on this, you would have to see ways in which they can be specifically brought to bear upon each other in ways that I don't think are really happening at the moment.
Just to tie these two sets of comments together.
Janice, do you mind if I give Hari the opportunity?
Oh, no, it's fine. Go ahead, Janice. You should finish.
It just speaks to what Hemi and Hari. So I'll make it really quick.
Hari, go ahead. Hari will come back to you.
And turn it over to you. When we ask the question, what are international institutions for? In a fundamental way, that connects the conversations that we're having. And I would suspect that the answer to that question is going to differ depending on the international institution that we're looking at. So if we're talking about the WHO, we are going to be less concerned as democratic publics about This Week in Virology, which is a phenomenal network of virologists that are global, that frankly identified the virus and the spread by early January. Anybody in the know knew, and they were trying to get the attention of national decision makers. I don't think there is a democratic deficit when we think about those kinds of networks that operate very effectively. I think it's a very different story on trade. Because one of the reasons that we took trade out of the political marketplace is because we had very highly organized interest groups on trade that would get very specially designed provisions that advance their interests. And so paradoxically, the argument was, if you truly want to think about the collective interest, you take it out of Congress or you take it out of Parliament, because you're going to actually empower special interests if you leave it embedded in the process. So we need a fine-grained answer to what are international institutions for, which depends on the international institution, I think, and how and where they become compatible with democracy is also going to differ across the kinds of international institutions.
Thanks, Janice. Harry, let me take it over to you then. I want to bring in a couple of questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, I'll be quick here. But just to build on what Janice just said about, how do we think about what international institutions are for? And, Henry kind of ended with this point of like, how do we think about the relationship between international institutions and the publics? And as we look around and see all these transnational networks that are emerging, the science networks, in addition to the protest movements and a lot of this work that's happening, a lot of that's happening as a groundswell from the bottom up, as opposed to being centrally coordinated necessarily from a centralized institution. And I think that one of the things, Alina, to go back to the question that you asked at the beginning is, in some ways, democracy has been on its back foot in trying to sort of justify the gains for people, from living in a democracy and having the freedoms and the liberties that are associated with it. And, certainly in the United States, I don't know the data as well in other countries, we see that people are more and more willing to give up democracy, right? They're much less willing to think of democracy itself as a value or something that they want to adhere to. And I think the way that sort of relates to this conversation that we're having is this question of, even as we see two things that are true, right? The international institutions, the big centralized bureaucracies are struggling, even as all this innovation and transnational sort of groundswell of activity is happening. And so there's almost a sort of broken link between these two things. And so where do they come together? And I think part of the challenge that Henry and I were thinking about in our paper is, how do we think about that challenge, not only in terms of what do these networks and this groundswell of activity, what is it that those people want or need in order to respond to the problems that they're trying to solve, but also what is the supply side of the types of institutions that you need to be able to accommodate and be accountable to that kind of a groundswell of network. And I think that historically, even within, if we look at sort of subnational and national institutions, we don't have as many examples as we could of bureaucratic institutions that are able to be authentically accountable to that sort of a groundswell. And so one of the challenges I think that we have before us is to think about how the sort of what I would think of as protest politics and institutional politics get knitted together again at the national level, and how that fractals up to, or layers up to, international institutions as well.
Sorry, that actually takes me to a couple of audience questions. I'm just going to pull some of them together. We have about 5 minutes left, and there's a lot of questions. I see that there's a lot of questions about whether a multi-stakeholder model of international governance that includes private sector governments and NGO/civil society could be something that's sustainable for the longer term. We talk about international governance. And related to that, there's quite a few questions about the US role in the world, given that the United States has failed to participate, for example, in the virtual vaccine summit in May, where the Canadian Prime Minister called for unity of effort in overcoming the crisis. Some of you have already mentioned the US absence from the world stage, and what are the long-term implications of that, potential implications going forward? Regardless of what happens in the elections, this trend might continue. We don't know, because as Anne, you pointed out, some of this trend was already there prior to this administration as well. So on the one hand, the sustainability multi-stakeholder model, and then the other hand, the role of the United States in the world, and what are the long-term implications. So let me see, who would like to take that question? Anne, go ahead.
I don't know, do we raise our hands? I mean,
I think you can just speak. And I was wrong, we actually have 15 minutes left, so perfect, so go ahead.
I mean, US absence on the world stage is, again, this is one of the central issues of our time. So the current system, whether you mean the UN system or whether you mean something broader than that, is set up around the idea of American leadership. And the absence of American leadership was one of the most striking things about this crisis. Carl Bildt, who's a former Swedish prime minister and foreign minister, said to me, right, in April, he said, every single time there's been any, from an earthquake to a war to an event in an African country or a Latin American, every time anything has ever happened, first everyone waited to see what the United States would do. And then everyone reacted. I mean, for better or for worse, it wasn't always, and this time there was nothing. There was no reaction. There was no attempt to coordinate. As I said, there was this one ridiculous meeting of the G7 that produced nothing. And actually in my paper, I talk a little bit about this meeting organized by the European Commission to bring together not just democracies, but also some NGOs and other groups to start talking both about funding a vaccine and then about distributing it so that it's not, so that it becomes democratically available to lots of countries. And the absence of the US and the question of whether that continues is the main one that we all face over the next several years. And look, the dissatisfaction of the US with the world system as it is not just limited to this administration. I mean, this administration has kind of put it on steroids. But some of the language that you hear is familiar to me, this dislike of institutions that can hold the US to account, the dislike of the International Criminal Court, that goes back a decade. Questions about, should the US be part of a big climate change, institute or group or set of rules, also goes back a couple of decades. There have been, this is not a new problem for the United States. And the question of whether the United States can sort of fit into any of these institutions is a very old one. I mean, again, my solution to it, as I've said already, is to create institutions that are more ad hoc, where the US can feel comfortable participating for some period of time towards a specific goal. And the other solution would be to make sure that the US is working, that we return to some system whereby the US works with allies and at least can be used, can work in congruence with countries that see along the same lines. But I do think I particularly hope Europeans begin to accustom themselves to the idea that the US is not going to be the central organizing power that it was for a lot of reasons, not just because of the Trump administration. And that this maybe inspires Europe to have a louder voice, maybe it inspires some more creative ways of organizing international institutions and international movements of all kinds. But it's the central feature for the central problem we're all going to deal with for the next decade is the reduction of the influence of the United States.
Thanks, and it strikes me as well that when we talk about Europe, of course, there's the EU, which is the institutional version, and then there's Europe more broadly, which encompasses all kinds of different meanings to a lot of different people. And it strikes me that we often don't think of the EU as one of the international institutions that we talk about, but of course it is an international institution. And in some ways, maybe perhaps a bit of an outlier because a lot of the COVID response has been organized at the EU level. Sure, it has been.
Eventually they got their act together. I mean, the EU they didn't, not initially, but after some time they began both to coordinate purchases and also they're now coordinating their economic reaction to some extent. So, the EU is, but yes, I mean, the EU is but again, the EU is, the EU has chosen particular sets of issues that it works on. The EU doesn't deal with everything.
Yes, but it's an interesting example of an international body that, while slow, did actually ramp up its efforts, and they have been relatively effective as far as I can tell.
But if Elena, now if you think about the EU, it is probably at the forefront of Henry and Harry's concerns about an institution with a very serious democratic deficit. So again, I think it's so important that we make clear the criteria that we're using. Do we want an EU that finally got its act together and coordinated now on borders, so they have a shared list of who can come in and who can go out, coordinated on funding, as Anne just said? That looks, after a terrible start, like a pretty impressive performance, but there's no democratic voice at all in any of it.
That's not quite right. I mean, the EU actually has its own parliament and it has representatives who speak for it.
But it didn't play any role in developing these recommendations. Absolutely not. They all came out of the commission.
But the commission is a reflection of the EU governments. I mean, the governing body of the EU is the European Council.
but that's formal.
Which is the governments,
right?
of the member states.
Yeah, but that's formal, but there's been absolutely no democratic voice in shaping these regulations. It's all been done by technocrats and bureaucrats, and they probably, I don't know.
True. I think you'll find that national leaders played a very large role in, and actually the economic response is happening entirely at the level of the European Council. But anyway.
Okay.
What I think is interesting about this conversation is that obviously we have a lot of academic debate about the so-called democratic deficit of the European Union. I think we could have that conversation for a long time. And I think, in my view, there's probably truth to both, meaning that we see very low participation in European level elections, being these kind of secondary level elections. But there are elections, obviously there are representatives. But I think the question to my mind has been, how do these EU institutions try to reach a broader swath of the population, try to actually communicate to people about everything that the EU and its institutions are actually doing? Because what we've seen, we're talking about, countries like Hungary, for example, what we've seen is individuals like Orban, of course, benefit hugely from European investments that are coordinated at the EU level, while at the political level, really bashing the European Union in various ways. And I think there's been this huge gap of understanding among citizens as to what they're getting from the EU, like free movement of labor, free movement to travel, all these kinds of harmonization things, like not having to switch your phone SIM card every time you go to a different country, right? It's something we had to do. But at the same time, that's not very clearly communicated to the general public. And then oftentimes we get into these debates about whether the EU institutions are these technocratic, bureaucratic entities that aren't responsive to individuals' needs. So Henry and Hari, because Janice mentioned some of the worries you might have of institutions like this, I want to bring you into the conversation. And if you do want to touch on one of the audience questions that I mentioned about the sustainability of this multi-stakeholder governance models, please feel free. And I might throw another one in there for you, for the both of you. That also comes from the audience regarding the question of whether there's something we're not really paying attention to. I think this comes from a place of the reality that we've been focusing a lot on Russia, China, on data collection, surveillance, privacy, and censorship, all these issues. But perhaps we're missing something by over-focusing on this. The recent protests in Hong Kong come to mind, according to this audience questions. What might be something we're not watching right now that you suggest we pay more attention to going forward? So I just put a lot out there for you, Henry and Hari, so feel free to respond to any of that.
Okay, I'll try to respond very quickly. First of all, on the EU democratic deficit question, I think you can see how on the national level, political parties have been weakened. This is an argument that Peter Mayer makes, which both of us rely on in our book, or in our chapter, talking about how this has limited contention at the domestic level in the EU, because the centre-right and the centre-left became increasingly indistinguishable from each other. So the corollary of this is that you might expect to see more actual democratic engagement happening when there's more disagreement at stake in the European Parliament. Of course, we don't have that at the moment, nor do we have that sort of more generally, which is one of the reasons why we have people like Orban being able to nestle very carefully in the existing system, because the European People's Party, which is the main Christian democratic formation, needs Orban's support, or wants Orban's support in the European Parliament. And you get a system which is like what Rob Mickey describes as authoritarian enclaves of the sort that happened in the non-democratic American South in the 1960s, where everybody knew that African-American voters were being effectively taken off the rolls. Because at national politics, the Democratic Party needed the support of the senators, they were prepared to hold their noses and pretend that this wasn't happening. Multi-stakeholderism, the best example we have of this up to date is ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Signed Names and Numbers. It's safe to say it hasn't worked particularly well. We have seen more or less the problem is it's very hard to get people to pay as much relentless attention to ICANN ordinary people as lobbyists, with the result that it effectively becomes captured over time. And I think that the one thing that I think really we ought to pay more attention to is how many of the people who are getting involved in the protests over the last few years are moving into ordinary political party activity, looking to get elected. I think that's really where things are going to change. I'm an immigrant to the United States from Ireland. Two things impressed me when I came to the United States. First of all, the incredible Tocquevillian level of volunteerism and how much of this was done by women who were, they had kids or they had kids, and they were effectively the people who got things going and did things in the community. And secondly, how completely apolitical this all was. The first is still there, the second is changing. And I think that the role of these women and these cross-racial alliances, when they really begin to get engaged in political electioneering, I think that's something which can have some very profound consequences. But this is really Harry's area far more than mine, so I would defer to what she has to say on that.
Well, I'll just add to what Henry said, and Alina, to the audience question about what is it that we're missing. One thing that we haven't talked as much about in this conversation, but has come up in earlier panels over the course of the day, is just the question of inequality. And Eric Schmidt talked about the sort of threat to this question of how is it that we can realize the American dream or not? And I would sort of broaden that to sort of say, how is the question of economic inequality threatening democracy or the global order in other ways around the world? And the reason is that I think that so many the more open kind of democratic societies are only as strong as the public acceptance of them, right? And if people don't realize any of the benefits because of extreme forms of economic inequality, then their willingness to accept some of these other regimes, I think, is going to be much more limited. And I worry, to build on what Henry said, I worry when we think about it merely as a communications challenge, because I think part of it is things like the EU communicating what is the benefit of being in multi-state institution. But part of it also is people have to experience it in their ordinary lives. When these institutions feel so far and so distant from them that, if they see an ad every now and then telling them the benefits of being part of an EU, I don't know that it necessarily is going to strengthen that level of public commitment that we need to actually strengthen democracies relative to non-democratic regimes. And so that's an area where I think we, I spend most of my life thinking about US politics and, where the sort of micro politics of nations that we're thinking about really matter for solving some of our more macro transnational challenges that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Harry. And we have a couple of minutes left, but I want to give Janice and Anne a 30-second opportunity to maybe respond to this question of what haven't we talked about? What's missing here that you'd like to put on the table that we need to think about for the future? So Janice, let me give you the opportunity to speak to that very briefly, and then Anne, you'll have the final word.
Yeah, just two very quick comments. There are some outstanding examples of multi-stakeholder arrangements which bring together international institutions, foundations, civil society groups, which have endured and do very, very well. So I agree totally with Henry about ICANN, but I think you and I can both find other examples that have done very well. I don't think that's impossible at all. The final comment will be, I think the real challenge is going to be much more scrupulous and surgical in what we ask of international institutions. And we cannot expect that any one international institution is going to meet all the criteria that we put on the table today. So which ones are critical to hold accountable from a democratic perspective? Which ones are critical where we need to mobilize expert knowledge in a really fast way to respond to a crisis? And having that capacity to disaggregate and then set appropriate criteria, I think is the way forward.
Thank you, Janice. Anne, 30 seconds, final word.
Yeah. I'd like people to drop the idea of an international institution as a bureaucracy. Think of it instead as a network, groups of people who can be brought together to deal with a particular problem at a particular moment, or who who can be focused at this time and then disbanded at another time. I mean, the problem is the vision of people sitting in boring offices, pushing bits of paper, that has to end. We need to make sure that, and this is, by the way, true of national institutions too, but that we need to make sure that that people are being deployed in ways that are truly useful, and that's in national and international levels of government alike.
So thank you, Anne. And with that, I just want to thank all of my panelists for this really fascinating discussion. It was such a pleasure to have the honor of moderating and chairing this discussion. So thank you, Anne. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Hari. Thank you, Janice. I very much look forward to all of your papers and everyone else's papers that have been discussed throughout this conference, and to day 2, tomorrow, of the conference. And so, Frank, thank you as well for hosting this panel, and let me hand it back over to you to close us out.
Excellent. Thank you, Alina. Thank you for a terrific job of moderating an absolutely fascinating conversation. One just generated all sorts of incredible ideas. Thank you to the panelists for great presentations. And I will say the papers are even better. So now we're going to move to just a final wrap up. My partner in crime, Hal Brand, should be joining me here shortly. Hal, are you there? All right. We would thought we won't go on for too long. Hal had a 75-minute speech plan, but we decided instead that we would have a 2 or 3 minute summary. So what stood out for you about today? What were sort of the major themes that you thought were important?
So I picked up on 2 or 3 things that I think will come up again tomorrow, particularly as we move from addressing kind of transnational issues and issues of global governance into more of the hard security issues that'll increasingly come up tomorrow. And I think that one of the questions that a lot of the papers raise is how we're going to strike the balance between what are traditionally considered soft security issues, transnational challenges, and the harder security issues. And we've seen arguments back and forth over the past 3 months or so about how significantly the balance in US foreign policy and in international politics more broadly ought to shift. And I think this debate is understandable. Obviously, if you have a pandemic that may well ultimately kill a couple of orders of magnitude more people just in the United States than 9/11 did, it makes sense to shift emphasis from issues like counterterrorism to issues of human security. But unfortunately, the story isn't quite that simple. And so I think one of the things we'll get into tomorrow is that COVID actually hasn't led to an abatement of hard security challenges. It's intensified them, not just in the US-China competition, but in other places as well. And so what I think this is telling us is that the dichotomy that we sometimes draw between hard and soft security issues is false. And what makes world order so tricky in this area is that these hard and soft issues work in tandem and often exacerbate each other. The great power competition makes the transnational issues harder to solve. The transnational issues exacerbate great power rivalry, as we've seen over the course of COVID. Which brings me, I think, to a second thing that occurred to me just in the course of listening to a number of these presentations, which is the tension between what you might think of as technocratic solutions and geopolitical realities. And so there is sometimes a tendency to think of the fixes to problems like climate change or pandemics in essentially technocratic terms. But of course, there are profound political issues here, as we've seen during the pandemic, and these issues rapidly get swept up in geopolitical conflict. And so I think that the challenge for folks who focus on the transnational issues is to think about how proposed solutions might work in a world that's actually fracturing rather than converging. And the challenge for folks who think about the traditional geopolitical dimensions of conflict is to think about how you can generate cooperation on these issues that cross borders while you're waging that conflict. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is in listening to this most recent panel, the question that struck me is this issue of are we at a fundamental break point in terms of the trajectory of international institutions and global governance? Or are we just at another stage in the ongoing evolution of these institutions? And so we've seen times, even in the post-war era, when a lot of existing international institutions looked unfit for purpose. So look at the Bretton Woods system by the end of the 1960s, or the IMF and the World Bank at various points. And in some cases, we did see fairly sharp departures. So the Bretton Woods system broke down in the early 1970s and was replaced by something different. In other cases, we just saw existing institutions adapted and reimagined. Again, that's what happened with the international financial institutions. And so one of the things that I think about in listening to the great discussions we had today is which of these models of change is required today and which is actually feasible today. And I think that's an issue we'll get into tomorrow as well when we talk about the trajectory of the international economy and the trajectory of institutions like the G20 that had played an important role in responding to earlier global crises, but have been less effective in responding to this one. So those are the themes that stuck out for me. And I think we're going to be building on a number of them in tomorrow's sessions.
Right. Those all completely resonate with me. There were four things that really sort of stood out for me. One big theme, actually, and then four sort of minor themes. The one is, I think we're developing a consensus thus far, and it'll be interesting to see if there's pushback, that this moment amplifies and accelerates as opposed to being sort of a sharp break. And this is something you and I have talked about. But in that, the things that are accelerating, there's sort of four questions or forces that are being, I think it was Janice who said, had the spotlight put on, that I think came out today. And the first is, I think, this profound technological change. And I thought Eric was really good on this, but thinking about when you reflect upon how much the world has changed over the last 20 or 30 years and how much technological, this profound technological change has just reshaped our world. On the other hand, has all these unsettling consequences. And I thought that Eric's point at the end, which had been brought up in the last session about this, it has these positive benefits, but it can only work if it deals with the underlying questions of both global and national inequality, which I thought was really interesting. And relatedly is this question, the second issue I noticed is this wither globalization, right? And you see sort of three different patterns emerging. One, globalization is going to continue no matter what. Two, deglobalization is absolutely happening. You'll have these two different worlds. We've seen that in some of the presentations. But you saw, I think, both in Eric and Janice, a couple of the other presentations, this idea that there's this sort of in-between world where you could take what Graham talked about the rivalry partnership, where you could look at ad hoc arrangements, where you could find working arrangements that may not be at the headlines, but are really important, where you recognize that globalization has definitely engendered both political and other backlash that has to be recognized, but you don't want to sort of lose its benefits. This leads to the third insight, which was, I think, what we heard from the last panel, which I just found that conversation really rich, and that is the connection between these issues and governance. And institutions. I mean, I think we heard that in the debate that Anne and Janice were having about, and what you brought up with the technocratic versus the democratic view, and to look at something like the European Union, where some of its better aspects of its performance, whether they were connected to technocratic solutions or democratic solutions, right? I think that's something that's going to come up. And it also relates to this theme that we heard a lot today about whether this moment benefits authoritarian states or democratic states. And then the final thing, which is all of this is in the background of this US-China relationship, which is a shadow that looms over everything and is one of extraordinary import. We've heard a lot of different views. I know tomorrow we're going to hear some different takes on it. So, but all of this, none of this can be separated from coming to terms and wrestling with the sort of US-China relationship, which is obviously increasingly poisonous, with profound implications for all these questions. So those were my insights from what I think was a terrific first day.
Absolutely. And I would just take the opportunity to remind folks that we will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for a keynote discussion with Lawrence Summers, a former Secretary of the Treasury who's thought long and hard about many of these issues. And then we will follow it up with panels on technology, climate, and economics, and then American grand strategy and statecraft in the post-COVID world. So it promises to be an excellent discussion, and I hope we will see everybody back this morning. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our panelists and discussants for a terrific day today.
Yes, and thank you to everyone at SAIS and Johns Hopkins and all the people behind the scenes who have put together an extraordinary amount of work to pull this off. So thank you to you all, and we'll see you all tomorrow.